What's up? This is Eridaz. This is going to be a deck tech with Marchesa, the Black Rose. Now, she's a Grixis commander and probably one of the best Grixis aggro generals out there. She has 3 lines of text. First one says Dethrone. This basically means whenever you attack a player with the highest life total or tied for the highest life total, she gets a +1/+1 counter. Pretty simple. But she also says that all your other creatures have Dethrone. So whenever any of your creatures attack a player with the highest life total, they get a +1/+1 counter each. And then her third line of text, which is a key line, says that whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter you control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. Now this is what really separates her from the rest of the Grixis aggro generals, in my opinion. That's because anything with a +1/+1 counter on it, including herself, when they die they basically come back. So this basically means that they can dodge removal, they can even dodge exile if you have a sack outlet, and they can dodge rats. And rats are probably what stops most aggro decks from really taking off. And because Marchesa has this immortality ability, you really gain a lot of value from creatures that basically die or enter the battlefield and have some trigger. So that's basically what I put in this build right here. Creatures that gain value as they die or as they enter the battlefield. So let's take a look at the actual cards. So for lands, I have the on-color dual lands, fetch lands, shock lands, as well as some utility lands. Ancient Tomb standard gives 2 mana and it also does 2 damage. Now a key component of this deck is life loss, and I guess you could consider it as a suicide aggro type deck, because any damage dealt to you is automatically beneficial because you want to stay at a lower life total than your opponent. So Ancient Tomb, good stuff. City of Brass, good stuff. Mana Confluence would also be good. Unfortunately, I don't have that right now. I'm planning to add it as soon as it rotates out of format, so the price will drop. I have Pain Lands. I also have Opal Palace. Now this, I usually don't include this land in my decks, but because of its special property, you pay 1 extra mana to cast your general, and she enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. So Marchesa automatically becomes immortal once you activate this land with the extra mana. Then you have your standard sacrifice lands, Phyrexian Tower, High Market. We're going to have a lot of sacrificial effects in this deck because you want to sacrifice your creatures for value, especially those that enter the battlefield. So once they have a +1/+1 counter, you gain value by sacrificing them and then returning to the battlefield. Okay, so the actual cards. I have Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Soul Ring. These are your typical unfair artifacts. You gain extra value by casting them on turn 1 or turn 2, and you can have your drops 1 turn earlier. And getting your general out on turn 3 is especially important because then you can start pressuring the opponent as soon as possible. Now your basic tutors: Mystical Tutor, Imperial Seal, Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, and I don't believe I have Grim Tutor right now, but I might consider adding in the future. Randall Blast, best artifact destruction there is. I considered including a creature that destroys artifacts like Manic Vandal or something, but ultimately this is more all-encompassing, so I decided to add this instead. Thoughtseize, discard him to Turok. I have a lot of discard control in this deck. Merrick Fiend is a creature that when it enters the battlefield you can exile a card from your opponent's hand until it leaves the battlefield. But if you sacrifice it the moment it enters the battlefield, then that card is exiled permanently, so pretty cool little trick right there. Moving on, there's Reanimate. Not only can you get a creature back from your graveyard for extra value, you also lose life equals to its toughness, and most of our creatures are pretty low mana cost, so we won't be losing too much life at the same time getting as much value as possible. Moving on to our 2 drops, we have Into the Royal, return a permanent to hand. This is important because there are a lot of permanents that Grixis can't deal with, like enchantments, and planeswalkers can be a problem because we want to typically attack the player and not any sort of planeswalker. So this sort of helps delay and gain a form of control back in the game. So Snapcaster Mage, this guy can recast any sort of instant or sorcery in your graveyard for extra value. So he's pretty decent, and with Marchesa you can sacrifice him and return him to the battlefield and cast an instant that was in your graveyard. So pretty good value overall. Spectail Hatchling, this guy you can sack him for countering a spell unless an opponent pays 1. So typically you want your opponent to pay 1 extra mana for the spells that he casts. And he has a big brother, Spectail Drakeling, that counters a spell unless he pays 2. So good stuff. Mana Drain, probably the best counter spell out there, added in for the enormous value that you can get out of it. Bitter Blossom, not only does it make you lose life, you also get a Fairy Rogue, and when they attack together with Marchesa, they can get pumped up because of the dethrone ability, so you can get some pretty good damage going. It also combos with Skull Clamp. Now, since a lot of creatures are going to be dying in this deck, Skull Clamp is an essential addition. You just get 2 cards. It's probably one of the most broken artifacts out there. So, Dark Confidant, you lose life and you draw a card at the beginning of your upkeep. Pretty good deal. Demonic Tutor, Munoz Blackguard. Now, this card says whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter deals damage to your opponent, that player discards a card. So that means with Marchesa's dethrone ability, that's a pretty good combo right there to start getting your opponents to discard cards. And also some rogues, notable rogues in our deck include Sig, River Cutthroat, and again Bitter Blossom, because the token producer produces a Fairy Rogue token. Now, going back to Sig, now we're going to have our opponent lose 3 life a lot, hopefully, ideally, so this guy's a pretty good draw engine as well. Plunge into Darkness. Now this card has 2 modes. The first one says you can sacrifice any number of creatures and you gain 3 life for each of them. Pretty basic, but this is only used if we're falling behind in life a lot and we want to catch back up. This is a good way to have a sack outlet for your creatures as well as gain that extra life back. And the second mode is you pay X life and look at the top X cards of your library, and you basically select a card from it and exile the rest. So pretty good for tutoring up an answer and also losing life as well. Him to Torag, discards 2 cards at random. Goblin Bombardment, sack outlet. You can also ping players or creatures. Here you have your basic cygnets, Greaves. A lot of the cards in my deck benefit from haste, so Greaves are pretty important. Phyrexian Revoker, now this guy basically stops a lot of activated abilities, and with Marchesa he can be pretty resilient, so good addition right here. Talisman of Dominance, Indulgence, Mana Rocks as well as damage dealers. Umezawa Jite, now this is one of a few life gain cards in the deck, and it can also hit blockers so that they can be killed before you attack for any sort of alpha strike or anything like that. Winter Orb, you typically play this card against any sort of high mana curve deck like Maelstrom Wanderer. We don't want them to cast those big cards, so Winter Orb is a good way to lock them down. Chasm Skulker, now this guy, he gains a +1/+1 counter every time you draw a card, and when he dies you get a bunch of squid tokens. So not only does he combo with Skull Clamp, with Marchesa he automatically gains counters with Marchesa, with or without Marchesa, and if Marchesa is out and he dies, then he comes back as well as producing a lot of squid tokens. So awesome value right there. Sage of Fables, now she basically makes Marchesa enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, as well as any other wizards in the deck. And you can also remove counters, extra counters on your creatures for value, for drawing cards. and she has pretty good synergy with Chasm Skulker, because every time she draws a card, then this guy gets a counter, and then you can just remove that counter for more cards. So good synergy. Spectacle directly explained it before. Mendelian Click, amazing 3-drop. Basically, make your opponents put cards on the bottom of their library, or if you're running behind, you can just draw an extra card. And it's pretty aggressively. Yeah, it has 3 power, 1 toughness, and has flash and flying. So it can. It has a lot of. It has evasion, and it can also be flashed in at the end of the opponent's turn. So. Grim Hair specs, a lot of your creatures are going to be dying. This guy basically gives you card draw for that. Merciless Executioner, this guy's basically a flashback marauder. Each player sacrifices a creature when it enters the battlefield, so good for clearing out fatties or any blockers that they might have. Toxic Deluge, not only do you lose life, you can clear out a lot of big fatties, or basically any sort of wipe. Toxic Deluge or Damnation with Marchesa becomes a one-sided wipe because of Marchesa's ability. Right now I have 2 wipes. I'm considering including Rolling Earthquake or something, but we'll see. Dismember, again, lose life, and you can kill a 5/5. Chittering Rats. Now this guy can effectively perform a lockout with Marchesa, because the opponent puts a card from his hand on top of his library when he enters the battlefield, and then he can be sacrificed, and then if he has a counter on it with Marchesa out, he can be returned, and then the opponent keeps putting a card back from his hand into his library, so you can effectively lock a player out from ever drawing cards again. So pretty good win con, pseudo win con right here. Phyrexian Arena, standard, draw a card, lose 1 life. Unspeakable Symbol, this is probably the card that makes Marchesa truly unstoppable, because you pay life as well as give her or any creatures you have +1/+1 counters. So any sort of kill spell can be responded to with this ability. Necropotence, again, lose life, draw cards, excellent value. Chaos Warp, deal with those pesky permanents that Grixis has a hard time dealing with. Imperial Recruiter, a lot of our creatures, in fact most of our creatures, have toughness 2 or less, power 2 or less, so this guy's a good tutor. Shadow Mage Infiltrator, when he deals damage you draw a card. Good card draw, as well as evasion, so in case you want to get a strike in, hit the player for some reason, then this guy's a good damage dealer for that. Fulminator Mage, this guy destroys a land, or non-basic land, when you sacrifice him. And this plus Avalanche Riders are the only 2 land destruction creatures that I have out now, but I'm considering including, what else did I have? Goblin Settler, there's some other red land destruction cards. And unfortunately Braids is currently banned, so cannot include her. I also have, in terms of land destruction, Strip Mine and Wasteland. And Tectonic Hedge is also an option. So moving on, Astronaut Altar, sacrificial outlet, sacrifice a creature at 2 mana. So in case you want to cast a bigger spell, you can sacrifice one of your smaller creatures, get an extra value out of that. Good deal. Fire Covenant, you pay X life and deals damage as you choose among creatures. So not only can you hit your opponent's creatures and clear out blockers, you can hit your own creatures in case you want to bring them back later for extra value. Xiao Dun, this guy, you can sacrifice him and gain any black card from your graveyard back to your hand. Unfortunately, you can only use it before attackers are declared, so ideally we want to have him out for a single turn, or have Unspeakable Symbol, because then with Marchesa you can recur him for good value. Damnation, standard board wipe. Venser Shaper Savant, again returns spell or permanent to your opponent's hand, so any sort of tempo advantage is good. Calicos Deceiver, Now I'm considering switching this guy to Thrower of Temptation, the fairy that gains control of a creature. But this guy, essentially, when he attacks, you can sacrifice him and gain control of a creature that your opponents control. And with Marchesa, he can just come back at the end of the turn, so you can essentially keep stealing your opponent's creatures. Pretty cool trick right there. Glenelander Archmage. Now she has Persist, so she comes back with a -1/-1 counter whenever you sacrifice her. So with Marchesa, when you attack with her, she gets rid of that counter, so she can effectively stay on board for quite a while, ideally. Phyrexian Metamorph. Now I had Clever Impersonator here before, but this guy costs 1 less, and you don't need 2 blue mana, so this guy's a good deal. You can also copy an artifact or creature with him. Usually I end up copying a low mana cost creature, ideally Chittering Rats or something, so make your opponent just keep drawing the same cards over and over again. Now, Zealous Conscripts and Kiki Jiki form my one of my win cons. Zealous Conscripts gains control of a permanent, so with Marchesa out, you can effectively gain control of your opponent's creatures, attack with Marchesa and the creature itself, and with the Dethrone ability, you get a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you sacrifice the creature, but then because you control the creature, it returns it to the battlefield under your control instead of your opponent's control. So pretty cool little trick right there with Zealous Conscripts. And again, Kiki Jiki, not only can he combo out with Zealous Conscripts, he can also copy any one of these high value creatures for extra value. And moving on to our main finisher, Flare of the Hatebound. Now if this guy gets out with Marchesa and a sack outlet, he can effectively do 9 damage per turn. Not just your turn, your opponent's turn too. So why does that work? Undying. When he dies without a +1/+1 counter, he comes back with a +1/+1 counter. And then Marchesa out, if he does have a +1/+1 counter, he can just come back at the end of the turn regardless. And also he says that whenever he comes back, or another creature, any creature comes back from your graveyard to the battlefield, it deals damage equal to his power to target creature or player. So this guy comes back with 4 initially, and then 5 power, that is. So with Marchesa and a sack outlet, you can do 9 damage per turn. And with even more creatures, you can do even more damage. So this guy's effectively the top of our curve. I wouldn't include him if he wasn't so good, so I've played him out, and he works pretty well. So pretty good to include right here. Mind Twist, probably the best discard spell out there. Yeah, you want to keep your opponent's hands as low as possible so that your creatures can hit your opponent unhindered. Skeletal Scrying, you lose life, draw cards, and we have a lot of cards that go in our graveyard easily, so yeah, good value right here. And I don't believe I've covered one land, Bullrot Stronghold. This basically puts a creature from your graveyard to the top of your library, so you can just recur them for extra value in case you need it. So yeah, essentially this deck is an aggro control deck, so it's pretty weak to combo, but if you can get some good discard spells going and or have one of these guys, Mendelian Click or Spectail Trickling or Hatchling or Venser, you can effectively stop your opponent from comboing out. But otherwise the game plan is to control your opponent's hand, control your opponent's lands, and basically deny them resources until you can get an overwhelming advantage and win. So yeah, thanks.